Thank you for having me today. My name is Nicole Norelli. I'm a program coordinator with AgriLife Research. And in the spirit of full honesty, I'm actually quite new to this field. I'm about halfway through my MLIS degree. And this is quite a big change for me. However, I come from a background of over 10 years doing shorebird research with the Audubon Society and invasive species research over in California. And believe it or not, invasive species are a huge contributor to your potential risk for flooding and for fire. So that's another thing. I know our keynote speaker talked about kind of identifying threats that maybe you didn't initially think of, but believe it or not, if you have a field of arundo next to your building, then that is called the gasoline plant for a reason. It also causes major flooding, that sort of thing. So my talk is a little bit of a different perspective. We're not going to be inside libraries and collections with mine. I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective from the scientific side. I'm currently a member of the National Hydrologic Warning Council, and I just recently attended their Texas workshop this last year before COVID kind of shut down that sort of thing. And so that was quite an interesting perspective to be in my first stages of library and archival work, but also still one foot in the scientific world and the research side. And let me tell you, a lot of the same communication problems that you have internally to your organizations and your agencies are also occurring in the agencies that are providing you with your disaster relief information. So most of my information is specific to Texas, simply that's because where most of my research is, but this information applies to really anywhere that experiences major flooding, especially coastal areas. I know some of you are in Louisiana or maybe on the southeastern coast. These are all going to apply. So obviously climate change has gotten wild recently. 3 of the 5 wettest storms in Texas have occurred just in the past 20 years. And 4 or 5 of those storms have occurred right on Southeast Texas. So those of you in Houston know this personally. Harvey and Imelda rank in the top 5 storms for the entire country. And what was very interesting about Harvey and Imelda is Harvey was a much bigger footprint and overall a bigger storm, but Imelda dropped so much water in such a short amount of time that it actually is ranked almost on the same level. So of 43 inches that fell during that storm, 33 of them fell in less than 12 hours, which is why the damage from Imelda is sometimes quantified a little bit higher than Harvey, despite Harvey being a bigger storm. And believe it or not, Texas is responsible for 25% of flooding alerts that are sent out by the National Warning System each year. So that's just Texas. I mean, that's not including all of the coastal states that are experiencing this sort of thing. And it's really just going up. So I think flooding is always been a concern, but it's definitely going that way. And let me tell you, from a scientific standpoint, the technology is not able to keep up. Predictions are getting kind of wavy and they're getting back and forth because these varying rates of rainfall are messing up the predictions, which means we're getting less fair notice, and disaster response protocols are trying to adjust as we go, but really, how do you adjust those protocols if you don't know what's coming? So that's kind of another thing from that perspective, is like, if you're relying on that information coming in to build your protocol within your agency, it's kind of going by the wayside. They're trying to adjust as they go, but truthfully, I spent a whole day in a workshop where they were like, we're not sure what this is going to look like next year. So hydrologic warning systems are built, it's considered a 3-legged stool. It has these 3 major steps. And a lot of times from the scientific side, all that they're thinking about is the observation, the monitoring, the detecting. That's really the priority for them. A lot of those agencies, once they have the data, they sort of throw it up, but there's not a lot of thought given to how it's presented or the marketing in order to help people understand it. And this could be another element of your protocols. Other than just thinking about your collection, obviously keeping your people safe, these are all really important, but a lot of times this information is not available in a very usable format. These gauges are incredibly difficult to understand, and yes, they're online, you can Google them pretty easily for most of your areas, but in my next slide, you'll notice that they're almost impossible to read. And if it's hard for you, then it also means that patrons and sometimes even emergency services in your area also don't understand how to read these things. Believe it or not, there's not training given to most fire departments unless they develop their own. There's not training given to a lot of emergency responders unless they do their own on how to actually read the data that's coming from USGS or NOAA. And a lot of times a federal alert isn't Even though they can do it regionally, it's not as useful as, say, a county level alert, but those might not be as easily accessible or as easily understandable. And then part of that is responding as well. And for those of you who are working in collections that are serving the public, this is especially important because while you're trying to save your own collection, I'm certain that you have people pounding on the door, especially the people who rely on your library for internet access, asking what's going on. Where is this information coming from? How can they find out more? So it's important that if that's an element of your agency, to add that into your protocol as well, is that you're not only saving your own collection, but you might have to answer user or patron questions to that effect. So flood warning systems is a whole branches of things. The technology is only one very small part of it. And there are actually sensors all over the country. The USGS runs thousands of gauges that are constantly taking data minutes at a time. And it goes up online and that doesn't really go anywhere. So you have all these nice, like you have the recognize the risk, you have this long-term operational commitment just to the technology, and then it's all this data that's floating around that doesn't go anywhere. And I know that some of you as archivists are like, oh, this is making me cringe, because it's truthfully, it's just sitting out there with no context whatsoever, no guidelines whatsoever. And that understanding that can help you, and it can help you to help others. So if we have all these tools, why are incidents still so common? Obviously, we hear about people driving into high water all of the time. It happens with intelligent people. It happens with people who maybe don't have as much education in that department. It happens with people who watch the news every day. It happens with people who don't. So it just keeps going on. And a big part of that, like I said, is that difficulty in understanding and accessing that data. The gauges are available online. They're almost impossible to read. There's a lack of consistent protocol. So the same way that you sometimes in your agencies have a hard time maybe keeping up training consistently. Maybe you've trained one person in disaster relief, but then they leave and you realize the next person hasn't been trained properly. Keeping that consistency within your agency, that problem also happens with flood warning systems. And for those of you who live in New Orleans, I'm very sorry to tell you, there are very few gauges within the city, which is unbelievable to me considering it's literally falling into the ocean. And a lot of the people on that team right now do not have a flood warning background, and they're great guys. They're really teaching themselves quickly, and they're actually putting in a lot more tech as quickly as they can, but they are teaching themselves. And this happens quite often. So when you're building your protocol, again, consider that where you're getting the information to build your protocol internally may not be as strong as you hope. And it might require a little bit of research and a little bit of understanding of where it's coming from. Obviously, for your patrons, poor internet or cell connection can be an issue, and them not understanding what's happening. Maybe that's why they're coming to you. Poor marketing really on the flood warning system end. A lot of those scientists spend every day working on gauges and building their own protocols for sending out national alerts or predicting and modeling and that sort of thing. And there isn't as much time or funding or effort put into marketing to the public. And that includes emergency responders and services like libraries. So when you guys are trying to build your system and you go to look for the answers you need and it's not there, it's because that department might not even have that sort of thing in place yet. I was really surprised to sit through that workshop and to find that there was more than one county agency that said, nope, we just don't have time to tell people about what we have. And it's a little bit distressing to me because I've always been a person who believes in putting one foot in both worlds and trying to understand both sides of what I need. But I understand too, there's sometimes just no funding, there's no time, that sort of thing. So that's something to consider. And the flood warning system protocols really vary by county or even down to a city level. So depending how your city is built, the system that's in place, even who runs the flood warning system. Sometimes it's a dedicated flood warning system. Sometimes it's something that's just being done under the water board of your local city. That can vary from region to region, and it does make it difficult to make a consistent plan across the board or do consistent marketing. And then, of course, as we experience, they are also competing for funding, they're competing for outreach time and effort, and they're competing for marketing space. So when you're developing your plan internally, consider Do you know where to find real-time flood information for your direct area? Not just NOAA, not just USGS, like national level alerts. Do you know what your county has in place, if they have anything in place at all? Do you know where the flood warning crossings are upstream from you so that you know what to check for alerts if the water is literally coming up the street? A lot of people don't realize that it can be blue skies over you, but if it's raining 10 miles away upstream in your watershed, that water can hit you in a matter of minutes. We've had issues like that here in Bell County where it was a beautiful day and all of a sudden downtown Belton was flooded just because it was raining upstream in the watershed in Hamilton. Do you know how to read those graphs? You know, that's important. That's an important part of your training. Do you know if your county has an emergency alert system? That's important both for your staff and also for patron questions. Do your patrons know it exists or how to sign up for it? And is there a backup of the documentation of your protocols and training? Just the same as for your saving your collection, the training about how to identify where to get that information is very important, and believe it or not is missing for a ton of the flood warning systems that we do consulting on. So this is a really quick example of what I mean by the gauges being difficult to read. This is a gauge at Fort Hood, Texas in a low water crossing, but the gauge is actually set at about 9 feet off the ground. So if you were just to go to the USGS website and look at it, you'd be like, wow, the water's at 9 feet. No, it's just where the gauge sits. And unless you know to read it that way, you would not know what was going on in that system. And then obviously this shows a spike here where it jumped up to 8 feet, but it looks like it jumped up to 11 feet. And on Fort Hood, this is a big deal for military training and that sort of thing. But really this same issue happens with almost any gauge. Very rarely is the gauge down right in the waterbed. And almost all these graphs look this way. So they're very difficult to read unless you know what you're looking for and you know what your personal system looks like. And data processing display can be quite different. This is a really beautiful one for Harris County. Bless them. They have an amazing system. They have a huge dedicated team that just constantly is updating this sort of thing. And honestly, they are the gold standard. We use Harris County for almost every other county in Texas to try to give them an example of websites they should have and ways to make their things readable. So this is a really nice one, but if you Google your local area, do not be surprised if it looks nothing like this. It might just be a bunch of squiggles on graphs with very little information. So why should you care? Obviously, your collection is probably a refuge in a time of crisis, especially if you run a public collection. So education and outreach, and it's not our responsibility to like market flood warning alerts and that sort of thing. Obviously, we already have 10 million things on our plates, but it is important to understand that that information is not getting out there otherwise. Flood warning professionals really struggle with this, and it's something that came up multiple times in the workshop, is that they're not getting that information out there. They don't even know how to get that information out there. They don't know how to get people to read it. And truthfully, that's a little bit of our specialty. So when we're building our disaster relief programs, maybe we should consider pitching in on that a little bit in a way that maybe they can give back to us. Maybe if we're supporting their systems and their marketing, they get funding to then provide us better information on when the water is coming up the street. And you might potentially have a protected building. This is probably mostly relevant to like islands outside of Louisiana and out in the Gulf Coast. But I used to live on Grand Isle, and actually the library is one of the raised buildings on the island, and it was a safety point. So it was not only important that they had all this information about the flooding and the storm alerts and that sort of thing, but that they knew that their building was that spot that people were being told to go to. So it could even be a potentially gathering point for your community. And so it's a little bit of back and forth. We need the emergency support. We'd like to have better modeling. We'd like to know further ahead of time when the water is coming at us, and they need marketing support. So maybe that's something like moving forward as I move into this field, hopefully I can help bring that sort of thing and make more of those interdisciplinary connections. And somebody from the Central Texas area, she was emphasizing, Katie, was emphasizing the importance of establishing trust with agencies and first responders before events occur. And again, that can be a little bit of our specialty. They really struggle with getting information out to emergency responders before an event occurs, engaging the public before an event occurs, because you don't want to be in the middle of a flood all of a sudden trying to put this together. And you don't want to be in the middle of the flood trying to protect your collection and having people just hounding you for information. So it's like just best to have it all ahead of time. So this is quite a long slide, and I'll share my presentation later so you can catch up on it later. But this was my big question to the panel when I got there as somebody who is a new library and information professional from a science background, and what I wanted to see from them. And I asked, what would you recommend is the best way for the public to support their efforts at flood warning, which in my mind supports us in protecting our collections? And what are the avenues for the public to educate themselves on your work and provide feedback, which you think would kind of go hand in hand. And truthfully, there wasn't a good answer. They mentioned that you can vote to support flood funding the same way as I'm sure we would answer you could vote to support the arts and collections and protecting libraries and that sort of thing. But beyond that, there was nothing offered in the way of engagement or social media or even really all that much interest, which was too bad. And a lot of the panel members voiced a worry that the public would misuse information or data that was provided to them. And I think this was so fascinating to me because now I'm learning how we make data usable and accessible to our patrons. And I think it's a niche spot that when we're creating our disaster relief programs, this is something we can fill in. This is something that we can really make part of that, and we can strengthen both sides of this. Almost a bridge, really. And regional agencies noted that the public could contact their local government the same way we might ask them to support certain measures and try to educate themselves on their area. And honestly, there's a lot of people who will choose to go to a local collection for that information. And communities would likely benefit from training for emergency responders. It was noted that a volunteer police chief in Salado actually created his own warning system simply by putting together the USGS gauges that he could find online and putting together a protocol for how to read them and then training his staff on it. So I'm sorry to say most of this kind of bulks up to there's not as much information to help you create your disaster plan as you would hope. However, it's fixable, and truthfully, they need us. So these are some quick resources. The National Hydrologic Warning Council is going to be my favorite one. It's a website that has everything. They have webinars, a newsletter, they have real-time data actually by state. So you can go in there and find gauges for your area. They don't have it down to county yet, but that's something that they're working on. They do an annual symposium, and that may be something you consider is not only attending library and collection-based symposiums, but maybe finally send somebody to flooding workshops, fire workshops, even invasive species workshops, because as I said, they are a huge factor in flooding and fire. Networking and news on flood warning programs, helping with those efforts, hopefully will come back to us in a way, and contacting any local experts through the council. So the council is made up of experts from all over the country who specialize in this kind of data. Your county flood control district, if you have one, flood warning system alerts.org is a really general one, although there was an incredible presentation about how they have thousands of accounts, but people don't understand that they actually have to go in and sign up for the alerts. So they were making accounts and then not actually getting any alerts through. And that's the sort of thing that, a patron comes through and maybe they're signing themselves up on the computer, and it might be something you could just keep at the back of your mind when you create that program. City water boards, county emergency services, as I said, it is different in every single county. Every single county has different people who handle water, who handle the gauges, and sometimes the people who do it do not have any background in this. So important to keep in mind. And that's about me wrapped up. If you have any questions, please let me know. And thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I know that I'm a little bit new to your side of this particular problem, but hopefully I provided a little bit in the way of where the scientists are on the other side.
In our minute and a half remaining, the question is for the presenter who talked about rainfall measurement, etc. What practical use can we practitioners make of this kind of data in various parts of the disaster prep cycle?
My answer would be find out for your local area either who runs, if there are gauges in your system, who runs them, and how to read them. Because the way that applies is just that part of your disaster plan can be so-and-so checks the gauges maybe every hour. They check where the water level is rising, how fast it's rising, because that could make a really big difference in the protocols that you employ and what you decide to move when, depending on how fast that's moving and what the rate and depth is coming at you. So like I said, like that firefighter in Salado, he just started checking all the USGS gauges upstream of his location, and he trained his team to check them I think they were checking much more often, maybe every 15 minutes during what they call a stormwater event. So when it's raining, but it's important to keep an eye on weather more distant from you too. So doing a little bit of digging into what your watershed is. So, and you can find those maps quite easily, but it'll tell you how the water drains in your area, where you should expect it to be coming from if it's coming at you. I think that's all quite valuable in developing the timing for your disaster preparedness plan.